So to this point, you should be quite proud of yourself for really starting to get the basics of understanding how to create Windows Phone applications by getting a solid foundation of knowledge when it comes to things like XAML to lay out your application of what it's actually going to look like, as well as understanding the model view model pattern, or MVVM. So with those two things together, you can definitely start to create some applications that you are able to actually then market to different users and actually get it out on the stores and get them on people's phones, which is ultimately the goal. But if you really want to begin to wow your end user, or at least be able to give them something that they're used to seeing, or some functionality that they typically associate with Windows Phone platforms, then you're going to have to start to be able to use some of the features that are built into the platform. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about as we start to go through some of these things is a very common thing when working with any mobile platform, but that has to do with being able to touch things or touch elements on the page, or work with gestures or taps or things of that nature. So the first thing I want to do is give you a very quick example of how to start doing that and how to actually manipulate things on the screen, or be able to know when things are being manipulated so you can handle those events and those actions appropriately. So as you can see here, I have a very simple application once again created, where I'm just going to work with the main page.xaml and ultimately the code behind file to give you a very quick example to see how this is going to work. So one of my favorite examples when I start to work through these types of things is to basically put some sort of shape, a circle or a rectangle or a square or something like that on the screen, and actually be able to move it and touch it and resize it and do different things like that. One thing I want to do here is, when I'm going to put shapes on the screen, we're going to use one of those layout controls, or those container controls that we talked about previously, and that's going to be the canvas. And that really allows you to position elements on the screen at really an absolute coordinate type system, and then kind of alter that based on interaction. So that's kind of a nice thing to be able to do. So I'm going to stick a rectangle on there, and you can put any shape on there you want. I just think this is an easy one to work with. And then we're going to set a few properties here. We're going to give this thing a name so we can work with it, and we'll call this my rectangle. And then we'll just give it a few more properties. We'll give it a width, we'll say of 150. We'll give it a height. We'll keep that at 150, and then we'll give it a fill color. We'll give it a fill color of blue. And then we'll also give it a stroke of blue as well. So that's going to be the line that goes around the outside of the rectangle. And then we'll give the stroke thickness a thickness of 1. So it's just a very continuous rectangle on the screen. So once we've got all that taken care of, we'll go ahead and save that. And we'll hit F5 to run our application. And once this fires up, you should see our little rectangle here, which is pretty nice. And as you can see, I can't do anything with it. I can click on it, I can try to drag it, but nothing's happening. There's nothing going on here. And that's because we're not handling any sort of events on the back end, or manipulations, if you will. So let's go ahead and reduce this, and we'll stop now, and we'll start to go back in and start to work on the code a little bit that's actually going to allow us to work with this and handle some of those manipulations. So if we head back into the code behind file, we're going to set up a couple private variables that are ultimately going to be what's going to allow us to do different things to this object. And when we actually change different aspects of it, those are typically referred to as transforms. So there's a couple different kinds of transforms. So we're typically going to work, at least for this initial one, with a translation or a translate transform, which if you hover over this, you'll see this really has to do with moving an object on the two-dimensional X and Y coordinate system. So I can move it up or down or diagonally or anything like that, but so it's really just changing the coordinates. And we're going to call this the move _move, or you can call it move transform. And just to keep things simple, we'll initialize this to be a new translate transform. So we're not going to do anything special with that. It's just going to be your run-of-the-mill transform. So then once we have that, another thing I want to do is really make it obvious when we start to work with this that something's actually going on in the background. So I'm going to create two instances of a brush. And a brush is just a mechanism for being able to paint objects or apply color to objects. And there's a couple different kinds. a couple different kinds, but I'm just going to stick with the basic one here. And we're going to have two different brushes here. So we're going to have the stationary brush, which is really just going to contain the current brush when the object isn't moving, so we can remember its color. And then we're going to have another brush here that's going to be the moving brush, we'll call it. And this is going to be equal to a new, well, like I said, you can make it an image brush, linear gradient, web view, but I'm going to make it a solid color. And we're just going to pick a color here. So we'll say colors dot, I like yellow. So let's go with yellow. So now we have a particular transform so that we'll be able to apply some movement in the X and Y directions for our object. We have a brush that's going to contain the color or the brush information about our object when it's stationary, and then we're going to change it to yellow when it's actually moving. So how do we do that? Well, there's a few different ways that you can do that, but at the very basic, what you can do is you can start to subscribe to things that are called manipulation events on a particular object. So if you look at our XAML page here, we have a name for this of myRectangle. So let's go ahead and see what we can do with that. So in our constructor, we're going to take a look at our myRectangle property, and we're going to start to look at manipulation. And if you start to see that, we have several different ones actually. So we have completed, delta, inertia, starting, mode, started, and starting. So these are all just different events that happen along the way of something actually being manipulated when it comes to this object. So we're typically going to deal with three here that typically make sense that you might want to pay attention to, but you can obviously do things for all of them. But we can work with started, which is what's going to be fired ultimately when a manipulation starts, obviously. Then you have the delta, which is going to happen several points in between after it's actually started while things are happening. So this is going to be fired several times. And then you have completed when all of the manipulation is actually done. And these can be fired several times for any object, depending on what you're actually doing with them. So we'll say when the manipulation starts, we're just going to add in a little bit of code here that's going to allow us to make a little bit of a change. So once a manipulation has actually started, I'm going to save off the color or the brush that's being assigned to the fill of the rectangle. So I'm going to save that off. So I'll say myRectangle.fill. We'll save that. And then we're actually going to set the fill to our moving brush. So that's going to change the color from the basic blue that it starts off with to yellow once we start to manipulate our object. So now we want to handle the scenario where we're actually going to be moving it. So that's by using the manipulation delta. And this is where we're actually going to use some of the arguments here. Now this args parameter here is actually a manipulation delta routed event args. Now it's kind of a mouthful, but there's a few things in there that you can take a look at. So what we're going to be concerning ourselves with right now is this delta property here. So what we're going to want to do once this manipulation delta is happening, once we're moving, we want to be able to track the movement via our transform here, this move transform. So what I want to do is I want to take my move transform and I want to set its x property, or actually I'm going to increment its x property based on the delta in the x axes of the arguments or of my actual object. So here I can say args.delta.translation.x. So that's going to modify the translate transform in the x direction based on the translation of the actual change of location of the rectangle. And we're going to do the same exact thing in the y direction. So we'll say y here and translation y. So that's going to allow us to move our object, our rectangle, in both the x and y and combination of those directions. And then ultimately we want to know when this is done moving. So we'll say when the manipulation has actually completed, all we're going to do at this point is we're going to set the fill back to what it was before. So we'll say myRectangle.fill is equal to the stationary brush. So that's all we really need to do to get this thing up and running. But the one final thing is we need to take this particular transform that we're using here, this move transform, and somehow get this thing associated with our rectangle or our object. So as you can see down here, we're handling some events, we're working with some manipulations, we're setting some values for this move transform, but nowhere in here have we actually associated this particular transform with our rectangle. So the way that we do that is we're going to come down here, we're going to say my rectangle dot render transform is going to be equal to my move transform. Now we're going to come back to this in a moment because it's going to be important to see that you're only allowed to set one particular transform or a transform group to this rendered transform property. So as you can see here, this doesn't take a collection, it takes a single transform. But no worries, we'll come back to that in a moment. So we'll go ahead and save that. So we have all this wired up, so that looks pretty good. We'll come back and take a look at our XAML. That looks pretty good. So now let's go ahead and fire this guy up again. Now what we would expect to happen here is once we start to mess around with this rectangle, we would expect to see it move and change color. So if I start to click on this and move it around, or try to anyway, nothing's actually happening. It's because there's one small thing that we need to take care of before we can actually handle these manipulation events. So we'll come back in here and we'll stop debugging. And one thing we have to do to actually enable us to be able to use this is we have to set something on this particular UI element called the manipulation mode, and we have to set it to all. So what this is going to allow us to do is allow us to handle manipulations of all different types, and by default we're not actually handling the ones that we need to, or actually any of them, so we're not actually getting those events firing. So now that we've got this manipulation mode set to all, I can hit F5 again to bring this up in our emulator. And now once I start to mess around with this, you're going to see that the rectangle actually changes to yellow once I'm moving this guy around, and I actually have this concept of inertia and actually being able to kind of glide this thing along. So if I were to drag this and let go, it's actually going to move around the screen, as you can see, without me actually having to do anything. So I can start to build things like games maybe where I have images or shapes moving around the screen. So that's kind of cool. But one thing you have to be aware of is that by default there are no bounds here on this screen. So if I'm messing around with this and I flick it off the screen, it's now gone forever. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. But now you can see how you can interact with and start to move these things around a little bit. So we've been working a little bit with these very generic manipulations, but there's also other ways that you can move with this, or all the other ways that you can interact with these objects, and there are some other event handlers that we're able to use. So if I were to come down and also take a look at my rectangle and say I wanted to handle the tapped event. So let's say I was going to come in here and do that. Maybe at this point I want to be able to maybe scale this rectangle, or have it grow maybe, or have it change in size. And we can definitely do that, but in order to do that we're going to need another transform. So we'll come in here and we'll create a new transform. So we'll say private. This time we're going to create a scale transform, and we'll call this the scale transform. And we'll set this equal to a new instance of our scale transform. So now when we come down in here, when this object has been tapped, we'll go ahead and start to manipulate this a little bit. So we can say that our scale transform dot scale x, we'll go ahead and increase that by, say, 25. And then we'll do our scale transform dot scale y is going to be adding 25 as well. So now this is where we're going to run into a bit of a problem that we started to allude to before, is that now I have a scale transform in addition to a move transform. So the problem here is that I can only set one transform equal to this render transform property on my UI element. So the way we get around that is actually by using something called a transform group. So we'll go ahead and create a transform group, and we'll call that transform group. So now what I can do with this is I can assign multiple transforms of different types to this particular group, and then assign this group to my render transform. So the way that we handle that then is we go into our transform group and we say its children. We're going to add to that a move transform, and we're also going to add to that a scale transform. So now we have two transforms associated to this group, and I can then assign this group to my render transform just like that. So we'll go ahead and save that. Now I'll go ahead and hit F5 again. So now we have our blue rectangle here, and now I can go ahead and tap on it, and you're going to see that it just got enormous, and I can still grab it and move it around, and it's a little big now, so you're going to have a hard time actually seeing the movement, but as you can see, it starts to move off the screen and down and around. So now I have the ability to be able to mess around with some of the properties and events and manipulations using these transforms to many different objects, and really any different object that inherits from the UI element, you are able to do these types of things too. So it's pretty cool. So one little thing, let's go ahead and come back in here, and we're actually going to change this scale a little bit because I picked too high of a number because these scales are doubles. 25 is obviously going to be very large. So now if I hit F5 and come back in here and start to tap on it, it's only going to grow a little bit. So now I can move it around, and I can let go, and I can tap on it, it gets a little bit bigger, and I can flip it around and grab it and twist it, and as you can see, it starts to get bigger. So those are some very cool techniques that you can use to be actually able to move things around in your app and actually create some very cool user interaction and handling some gestures to be able to do some cool stuff in your app.